Well, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you this evening, and particularly to our guests who are in Israel. So Jane and Dave Hantman, great to see you, and Mazel Tov on the arrival of your new granddaughter, Amy Eve. So great to have you with us this evening. And of course, Roy and Maris, also in Israel. Now, our guest speaker this evening needs no really formal introduction. He's actually in Bournemouth this evening, so it's very special. We know what a wonderful Lena, Davina, and giver of Divrei Torah David is, apart from his Megillah reading as well, par excellence, and also he curated the series Snack before our lockdown Sunday night at Kenton, but you will also remember that he's been curating 2 series during our Zoom programs. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce David rather than the other way around. And David actually spent his entire working life at the chalk face, as it were. And he began in 1972 at Lascelles Boys' School, which is a secondary modern, which is now Whitmore High in South Harrow. In 1974, he left Lascelles for Mellow Lane Mixed 11 to 18 Comprehensive in Hayes End in the London Borough of Hillingdon. And in 1979, he was appointed head of the English department at Park High, which was a 12 to 16 aged comprehensive school in Stanmore, and he was at Park High until 1986 when he was appointed Deputy Head of JFS. And as he remarks, if it weren't enough teaching 5 days a week, he also taught at Hebrew classes for many years, head teacher at Belmont Cheder from 1976 to 1979, and also at a number of other schools, Pinner, Hampstead, Kenton and New London. And also, he's also taught adults at Edgware Reform and Kenton, and he is currently teaching a course entitled The Great Hits of English Literature at the local U3A, and his talk this evening is entitled A Foresight Saga. So great pleasure to see you this evening, David.
David, you're muted.
Okay, we're better. Let me start again. Thank you, Michelle, for your kind introduction. And good evening, everyone. I'd also like to pass on my best wishes to Jane and David Hantman. And since Zoe is a former deputy head girl of JFS, let's dedicate this talk to and wish all the very best to her and her new child and their new grandchild. I should say, I suppose, at the outset that this is a talk cunningly entitled "The Four Sites Saga," which I thought was quite clever. You may or may not agree. And it's just a talk about the history of JFS. It's not a talk about the current circumstances to which JFS finds itself. So if there are still those of you at the end who want to ask any questions, please only on what I say. And I know absolutely nothing about the current circumstances about the school. Even if I did, of course, I wouldn't share them. Okay, so let's begin. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay. And I need to just bear with me half a second. And from beginning. Okay. Okay, that should be.
No, it's not showing fully there, David.
Where have I gone wrong?
You need to click on slideshow.
Yeah, I've done that.
Where it says resume slideshow, whatever, start there.
Oh, okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, good, thank you. Right, just let me give you a little brief introduction, and then we'll go on to the heavy stuff. As Rochelle has said in her introduction, I'm an English teacher by trade, and I was appointed to JFS in 1986 as a deputy head. I thought I'd be at JFS, I don't know, for 7, 8 years or so, I don't know. And then I would move on somewhere else, perhaps into local authority work, perhaps get a promotion of some kind, who knows. In the event, I stayed at JFS until July 2015, when I retired from teaching. So a question can be asked, why was I there so long? Well, I was approached for headship on a couple of occasions, but in the end, I decided that I had quite enough aggravation as a deputy head and I didn't need any more. And anyway, that was important work to do at JFS and I wanted to carry on doing it. Just let me elaborate. As many of you know, I was born and brought up in Manchester and I'm a member of a proud Manchester United supporting family. 2 months after I joined JFS, Alex Ferguson joined Manchester United and started the process that brought the club unprecedented success. Yes, I know things haven't been so good recently, but I suppose there are times when it looks as though the powers of darkness are in the ascendancy, but we live in hope that the light will be renewed, as we say, Bimhero Viamenu, speedily and in our days. Anyway, during his reign, Ferguson received offers pretty much from anyone who was anyone in the football world. Real Madrid wanted him as their coach, Chelsea wanted him, even England wanted him. But the reply, however, was always the same. As far as Fergie was concerned, he had the best job in football. He was the manager of the best club in the world. Any other club would be a demotion. Why would he want to leave? And I suppose I felt similarly. I had a great job in a great school. Where would I go that was any better? Which brings us back to JFS, a school that's existed in 4 locations, hence this title. So where did it all begin? Well, JFS can trace its history back to 1732, when a Talmud Torah was opened in the rebuilt Ashkenazi Great Synagogue in Duke's Place in the city of London. The object of this Talmud Torah was to give poor orphan boys the elements of education. It was funded entirely by donation. Donors included the Goldsmith family, Sir Moses Montefiore, and also Levi Baron Cohen. And his daughter married Nathan Mayer Rothschild, also known as NM, who was the patriarch of the English branch of the Rothschild family. Now, the Rothschild family is crucial to the history of the school, and we'll hear more about them later. Anyway, in 1788, the governors established rules for the Talmud Torah, and some secular education was introduced, including the 3 R's. The time allocated to Hebrew teaching was reduced, and the study of Talmud was now optional. Amongst other things, priority admission was given to orphans. Illegitimate children were not admitted. Every boy had to attend the Great Synagogue every day, and perhaps most interestingly of all, attendance was not compulsory. Heaven on earth. Which teacher wouldn't want to work in a school where attendance isn't compulsory? Well, the Talmud Torah plodded along, not always to everyone's satisfaction. Then in May 1811, a number of far-sighted men were appointed to examine the Talmud Torah and see what improvements might be needed. They concluded that the Talmud Torah should be enlarged and it would prove exceedingly advantageous to the community to add a free school, wherein Hebrew reading and writing should be taught, as well as English reading, writing, and arithmetic. Everything then went quiet for a few years, until in September 1814, a charity called the Free School for German Jews was created. A lease was obtained on a site in Ebenezer Square in Spitalfields. Now, here we have a map of the East End, which I doubt is known to many more of you than it is to me. The heavily blue areas are the heavily concentrated Jewish areas. So the bluer the area, the more Jewish the area. And we're talking about an area roughly around here, if you can see my little red light I can see it. I don't know whether you can, but it's here. Mr. Henry Naphtali Solomon was appointed headmaster of this enterprise on a salary of not more than £100, and JFS was on the way onto its first site. The new school, by the way, didn't amalgamate with the Talmud Torah. The aims of the school were merely every boy was aware of his Jewish identity and was literate in Jewish and secular areas. The Talmud Torah was for the scholars, whereas the free school would give its not-so-scholarly students what they needed in order to become something other than a peddler or a hawker. One such young man was David Wolfe Marks, who would become Chief Minister of the Congregation of British Reformed Jews and Professor of Hebrew Literature at University College. He began at JFS in 1821 as an orphan pupil, and reminiscing about his school days in an edition of the Jewish Chronicle published in 1898, he wrote, "The instruction given was of the lowest possible type. It consisted simply of English reading, spelling, and writing, the bare elements of Hebrew reading, and the first 4 rules of arithmetic." Actually, I've heard it said that there are a number of primary school parents today who would be quite pleased if their children received this allegedly low-type instruction. Anyway, the school roll continued to increase, and it was clear that it was outgrowing its premises. A new location was found not far away in Bell Lane, and in January 1822, JFS moved on to its second site, where it would remain until the outbreak of war in 1939. Picture of Middlesex Street, which is Petticoat Lane, and Bell Lane runs parallel with this thoroughfare. Now, this new school building was erected at a cost of £3,958, which is about £500,000 in today's values. And it was divided into 3 separate departments. There was an original Talmud Torah, a boys' school, and a girls' school. Rabbi Michael Goldsmith was the master of the Talmud Torah, Mrs. Leah Barnett was the governess of the girls' school, and Naphtali Solomon retained overall responsibility for all 3 departments. It was around about this time that the school came to the attention of the Rothschild family. And as I've mentioned, their role is highly significant in the JFS story. So I'd just like to take us, if I may, on a detour for a couple of minutes. In his 1892 masterpiece, Children of the Ghetto, Israel Zangwill, Jews-free ex-pupil, pupil teacher and teacher, writes, "Rothschild was a magic name in the ghetto. It stood next to the Almighties as a friend of the poor. How fortunate it was then that the Rothschilds decided to adopt the free school as their favourite charity." In his books on the Rothschilds, the historian Niall Ferguson writes that the firm of N.M. Rothschild and Sons gave the school an average of £9,500 a year. Now, that's getting on for about £900,000 in 2021. So you can see it's no mean sum. And they would give that throughout the 19th century. And that amount is more than doubled when individual members' donations are added. NM's NM's daughter-in-law, Charlotte, she was married to Lionel Rothschild, NM's son, was particularly devoted to the school. And by the 1870s, her efforts and those of her brother-in-law, another of NM's sons, Anthony, had transformed the school, more than trebling the number of pupils, increasing its annual budget by a factor of 20, and raising the number of teachers 25-fold. Anthony was elected president of the school in 1847. It was said of him that he loved JFS as a parent watches the infant he fondly loves. And when the Rothschilds became involved with the charity, it wasn't just a matter of attending a few meetings and doling out the cash. Members of the family would visit the school and talk to the staff and the pupils. Constance, later to become Lady Battersea, was NM's granddaughter, and she recalled in her memoirs, "When we were still in the schoolroom, we were taken to the Jews' free school, of which my father, this is Anthony, was the honoured president. We were asked to take a class and to hear the children read, and were permitted to question them upon what they had read. This led the way first to frequent and then to regularly timed visits. Indeed, I remember a visit that the current Lord Rothschild made to JFS in Camden Town, accompanied by the then Secretary of State for Education, the Right Honourable Kenneth Clarke MP. You have never seen a school become so tidy so quickly. In fact, there was a Rothschild on the governing body of the school until the 1980s, and the family was not uninvolved in providing the new premises the school now occupies. The school's link with the Rothschilds is also ever present because the yellow and blue of this is the JFS school badge, which they wear on their blazers. The blue and yellow are the Rothschild family colours. And at the bottom, you can perhaps make out the digits 1732 here, the date which is usually recognised as the foundation of the school. Now, by all accounts, the Rothschilds had the common touch, and they used their money responsibly. They were also clear about what their religion required of them as regards charitable giving. NM and his sons would have known what the Torah says in this regard, and we read this a couple of months ago in Parashat Bahar. V'chiyamuch achicha, says the Torah, if your brother becomes poor, and his means fail with you, you must support him. The Talmud explains that support him implies providing him with the means by which he can live. The ways to translate such principles into action was self-evident to the Rothschilds, for they upheld strongly the duty of the haves to help the have-nots. And what better way of helping the have-nots than by supporting its school in its efforts to produce graduates who would become self-supporting and contributing members of society. Okay, so after that detour, let's get back to the story. One of the major changes the school faced was the fact that from 1870 until the outbreak of the First World War, a significant proportion of its pupils were foreign-born. During the 19th century, that proportion remained relatively steady at around half, 50%. However, most of the remainder, although English-born, had foreign-born parents, so that only a small number of the pupils, perhaps 10%, it's thought, were both English-born with English-born parents. And a girl wrote in the school magazine of June 1914 that in her class there were 2 Frenchmen, 8 Russians, 1 Dutchman, 2 New Yorkers, 1 Romanian, a few Poles, a Liverpudlian, an Australian, a Mancunian, and some East End Britons. But they fraternised very well in spite of their linguistic difficulties. Interestingly enough, my own experience of the student population of JFS wasn't all that different. And I can recall students from, amongst other places, Bulgaria, Tunisia, Georgia, that's the one in the Soviet Union, Zimbabwe, France, Russia, South Africa, the United States, and of course Israel. The challenge for the school in those days was how to make Englishmen out of Jews. Some say the challenge today for the school is how to make Jews out of Englishmen. How would the school adapt this melting pot to English ways? Incidentally, the expression melting pot was first coined by him, Israel Zangwill, the Jews-free boy who would become one of the late 19th and early 20th century's most eminent writers and literary celebrities. The school, it was decided, would Anglicise these young people. And this was the word used by the press, the Jewish establishment, and others to describe the process. Indeed, in Children of the Ghetto, again, Zangwill writes of the bell of the great ghetto school, which of course was his school, summoning its pupils from the reeking courts and alleys, from the garrets and the cellars, calling them to come and be Anglicised. Now, Anglicisation meant teaching the pupils to adapt to England, and in such a way as to enable them to integrate successfully into the wider community. But Anglicisation did not demand any sacrifice of religious practice. Here you can see a picture of this gentleman here teaching his young charges to put tefillin on. The school wanted its students to remain observant. It was opposed to assimilation, and pride in being Jewish was encouraged. Never forget, Ferdinand de Rothschild told the children, so long as you live, you are Jews and Jewesses. And then, in March 1881, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. Although only one of the conspirators was Jewish, the Jewish population of Russia suffered a series of pogroms. The Jews took this as an invitation to leave, though it had seemed possible that the narrow economic base of Jewish life might be broadened under the murdered ruler. However, his successor, Alexander III, knocked all of that on the head with his May laws of 1882, which forbade Jews from settling or owning land outside the towns and forced them into a paid settlement. These pogroms and restrictions intensified a movement which had already brought 250,000 Jews from Eastern Europe. And it's been estimated that between 1881 and 1905, around 100,000 Jews from the Russian Empire settled in England. Probably 50,000 or around of those new arrivals settled in London, and the majority of them headed to the East End, where they swapped one pale of settlement for another. What would the school make of this influx of new immigrant children? Indeed, how would the Jewish community at large respond to the arrival of their brethren from Europe? Addressing this great wave of immigration, an editorial in the Jewish Chronicle in August 1881 proclaimed, "The foreign poor form a community within the community. They come mostly from Poland. They bring Poland with them, and they retain Poland while they stop here. This is most undesirable. Our outside world is not capable of making minute discrimination between Jew and Jew, and forms its opinions of Jews in general as much, if not more, from them than from the Anglicized portion of the community." And 2 years later, the Jewish Chronicle felt that our most pressing task is to civilize this mass of wronged and tortured creatures. And unless we perform this duty speedily, an outcry will arise against the newly come Hebrews, which will react terribly upon the comfort and reputation of the older settlers. We owe it to our religion and to our brotherly feeling. Now, you may agree with me that there's something rather unpleasantly patronizing to all of this. Wronged and tortured creatures indeed. Who do they think they're talking about? These were fellow Jews. But not only that, these older settlers were descendants of the men and women who'd been readmitted to England in the late 1650s, many of whom had done very well for themselves, thank you very much. A substantial number had become prosperous. They had the ear of the great and the good, and the last thing they wanted was to have their very pleasant and peaceful circumstances compromised by the arrival of these hordes of long-bearded, hair-covered, uncouth, ultra-Orthodox, Yiddish-speaking riffraff from Eastern Europe. Brotherly love can go too far, you know. Actually, en passant, this bit of journalism resonates even today. Vivian's parents came to England from Germany just before the outbreak of World War II, and they were given explicit instructions by the Board of Deputies as to how they must, or more importantly, must not behave. Not only in order to avoid drawing attention to themselves as aliens, but also, I'm sure, because the Jewish residents of England didn't want their non-Jewish neighbours to think these apparently pathetic, victimised foreigners with their funny accents were the same as them. Plus ça change. Anyway, back to the 19th century. The new immigrants, and even more important, their children, had to become English, and the Jews' Free School bore the brunt of this challenge with handsome support from Jewish philanthropists. The two main obstacles to this process were perceived to be, first, the continued use of Yiddish in the home, and secondly, the proliferation of the Chadorim and Talmud Torahs, where Yiddish was the language of instruction. Successive head teachers advised pupils and parents to discard Yiddish completely. This is a picture of Moses Angel, who was one of the great Jews-free head teachers. Head of the school for 55 years. Yeah, head of the school for 55 years. Makes my 29 sound a bit feeble, doesn't it? he also had too much time on his hands because he served on the editorial board of the Jewish Chronicle for 3 years. As far as Angel was concerned, Yiddish was an unintelligible language, and his successor, Louis Abrahams, described it as that miserable jargon which is not a language at all. Samuel Montague, who would become Lord Swatheling, said that JFS pupils should refuse to learn Yiddish from their parents. Indeed, they should teach their parents English. Everything the school attempted to do would be wasted if the children left their English school and returned, as it were, to the shtetl. Now, while the parents were prepared to entrust their children to the school for their secular studies, they weren't so confident when it came to religious education. For them, what the free school provided was inadequate, both in quality and quantity, so the children were sent to the chadorim that sprouted everywhere in the East End. The children went to them after school and spent many a long hour there. They were frequently shabby, ill-lit, ill-ventilated, and despite the allegation that the chadorim produced unhealthy, washed-out young people, they remained popular, well, at least with the parents. Not with Lord Rothschild, however, who in December 1898 wrote to the parents of the boys' school warning them they may be actually harming their children by sending them to Cheder. Visitors have noticed how pale and tired the boys attending the free school look. At first, a visiting inspector thought they may be underfed or they suffer from some form of home neglect. Indeed, if the parents continued in this foolhardy pursuit, his lordship felt that the boys, instead of rising in the industrial world, will sink into the nick of ill-paid and overcrowded occupations and remain the mere drudges of society. However, if the parents heeded his advice and withdrew their sons from Cheder, Lord Rothschild guaranteed that the boys would grow up fitted in every way to pursue an honourable career and with a reasonable prospect of becoming good and worthy English citizens. Together with the Jewish Religious Education Board, the Jews Free tried to replace the Chadorim by having its own teachers teach religious education in school after hours. But as late as 1937, there were still 9 Talmud Torahs between Mile End Station and Shoreditch Station. And it was only really the dispersal of the East End community during the Second World War that led to their demise. Nonetheless, Anglicisation was a success. Empire Day, first introduced in 1904, was celebrated in considerable fervour, and more than 1,200 former pupils fought in the First World War and suffered their proportionate share of death and injury. Here's the Roll of Honour, and you can see the plaques of the Roll of Honour in the car park of the Kenton site, on the walls of the car park. The head at this time was Lawrence. Of course, his name wasn't really Lawrence, it was Laser, but Laser Bowman, Lawrence Bowman, a Polish-born author and former pupil, and he wrote in the school magazine of July 1915, it was wonderful to see such unity of purpose with all other Britons in this hour of destiny. Sadly, however, in August 1917, Bowman's own son, Claude, a JFS alumnus, fell in action in Flanders. Now, between 1880 and 1900, 1/3 of London's Jewish children, it is estimated, passed through the doors of the Jews Free School. And it was estimated that in 1900, there were 4,000 students on roll, making it the largest Jewish school in the world. 4,000 students, which makes it roughly twice the size of what it is today. Amazing. It may have been a school for immigrants in one of London's poorest, noisiest, dirtiest, and most chaotic areas, but it provided its pupils with an outstanding educational experience second to none. Here's Lucian Wolff, writing in the Graphic magazine in November 1883. The Jewish Free School is the largest and most successful elementary school in the country. It is the principal anglicising element among the foreign Jews in the East End, whose children are mostly educated there. The number of its pupils is over 3,000, and its pass average at the government examinations during the last few years has been over 98%. I've already mentioned Moses Angel, whose dynamic headship spanned the greater part of the 19th century, and most of this examination success can be attributed to him. Angel had an outstanding staff, many of whom he had handpicked, supervised, and moulded. In fact, in 1853, Angel had launched a system of university teaching for the school staff. And this paid off not only in the high quality teachers the Jews Free had on its staff, but these superb results also increased the school's ability to recruit and retain a high number of university graduates. This is a picture of the boys' school staff of 1871, and you can see it's a group of earnest, serious young men. And you might see some rather fresher looking faces at the back. They're the pupil teachers, which was a sort of a 19th century apprenticeship scheme. But you can also see how far standards have fallen since then, because here's a picture of the JFS staff for 2012. And I'm being truthful. I mean, would you send your child to a school to be taught by this lot? Yes, it was pouring. Now, I don't know if my light is working, but over here, there's some idiot dressed as a chicken, about the less said the better. And over here is a very attractive looking lady dressed as a Japanese, Chinese lady. This is Mrs. Vivian Harris, the JFS's school recruitment officer at the time. Yes, it was pouring. We don't dress like that every day, more's the pity. However, after that bit of light relief, let's get back to work. From Angel's headship onwards, and anticipating the modern concept of succession planning, the school was led by a series of inspiring and homegrown head teachers. It was supported by communal philanthropists and a positive parental ethos. If one considers the means of the parents, it is highly creditable that so many should make sacrifices to give their boys as good a start in life as possible. This was a government inspector writing in 1913, and not only did the school provide outstanding results, but it also provided experiences and opportunities which few other children received at local authority schools, and which were in so many ways ahead of their time. For example, under the headship of Dr. Enoch Bernstein in the 1930s, the school could boast a pottery room, a printing room, a planetarium, and an aquarium. There was a 5-inch gauge model railway built by the boys. There was a model house in the girls' department, built by the boys, but used by the girls. And there was a camera club, a music appreciation society, a sukkah, and a science room. Now, these are only pictures I have of Bell Lane, but I noticed that joining us this evening, I'm delighted to welcome Jack Weinberg, who is an ex-pupil of Bell Lane, and we're able to tell you a lot more about Bell Lane than I can. It's great to see you, Jack and Rita. In 1925, the head of the girls' school, Mrs. Leah Teitelbaum, Miss Leah Teitelbaum, a woman with whom apparently one did not mess, established a weekend retreat in Seaford on the Sussex coast, where the girls would go to hone their social skills. But there was also a hidden agenda. JFS families couldn't afford holidays, and Seaford gave the girls an opportunity to get away from the crowded East End and enjoy the sea and fresh air of the Sussex coast. Some of you may remember Anna Mervyn Leach, who were members of the Kenton community. Anne's mother was a pupil at the Jews Free School at this time, and I spoke to her some months before she passed away, and I asked her if she went to Seaford, but she didn't. But she recalls Miss Teitelbaum, and she also recalls the Seaford programme. Anyway, as early as 1908, 1909, boys, of course, studied science. And here you can see boys in a purpose-built science laboratory doing macho things there with their test tubes and their Bunsen burners. 1908 purpose-built science laboratory. The girls had equally purpose-built rooms. That was domestic science. And you might be able to make out the quotation at the top. Every young woman is the better for knowing how to mend, wash, make clean, scar, polish. That was Moses Angel. I don't think it stops at the end, but that was Moses Angel. The school also had a school council, a newspaper club, a brass band, and a debating society. There were school outings. In 1887, for example, 1,700 boys were taken to the Crystal Palace, 1,700 boys on a school outing. These staff must have been out of their minds. Nowadays, of course, if you want to take 7 kids on an outing, the volume of paperwork is enough to put you off that for life. And there's a bunch of young persons in the 1930s enjoying themselves at Whipsnade. There were visits by the girls to the Tate, the British Museum, and the National Gallery. The teachers took a great interest in the lives of their students outside school, and the school provided uniforms, boots, and food for those who were in the direst poverty. In 1908, a boy proudly declared in an essay that every boy in my class has a clean collar. And this tradition continues. I don't ever recall buying collars. But as a senior member of staff with oversight of student welfare, there were trusts and funds on which I would draw, a number of which had been established in the 19th century and early 20th centuries by the Rothschilds and their rich friends, to make sure that no Jews-free student was barred from a school visit or music lessons or anything else because of financial need. And then there was the homework. We English, I think, are obsessed with homework. And the school demanded that its pupils do homework, must have thought it was part of the Anglicisation process. But these kids didn't have the luxury of their own bedroom or private space or a desk or anything like that. So where were they supposed to do it? Well, in 1909, the Jews-free opened play centres, one for boys, one for girls, and children who needed to did their homework there from 5:30 in the afternoon until 8 o'clock at night. But you could also do, among other things, drawing, painting, elocution, badminton, embroidery, boxing, puppetry, violin lessons, and not forgetting well-known pursuit of all modern Jewish young people, Morris dancing. Anybody know any Jewish Morris dancers? The Rothschilds paid half of the costs, and the other half came from the school funds and the community chest. There was even a JFS Pierrot troupe during the First World War. That was run by Mr. Josephs, and from it emerged Izzy Bonn, David Kossoff, and Alfred Marks. Robert Winthrop, or Bud Flanagan, as he became, had already left the school by this time, otherwise no doubt he would have been a member too. Now, if we fast forward to around about 2006, I'm sitting in a meeting, a senior leadership meeting, and somebody has come along to present an idea to us. And the idea is this. We're going to open something at JFS in Kenton called Extended Activities, where students could stay behind after school on Mondays to do, for example, photography, self-defense, badminton, classics, drama, and dance. Aren't we clever, we said. What a great idea. What great trailblazers we are. Whereas, of course, someone had already had that particular brainwave nearly 100 years earlier. However, there was a bridge too far. Miss Titlebaum, speaking on behalf of the boys' school, to let parents know that we wish to utter a strong warning to parents against picture palaces. The present craze can only result in harm. And Maurice Stone, who was at JFS from 1933 to 1938, has clear memories of his time there. The school was ahead of its time, certainly had more amenities than any other school in the area, he says. And I have the happiest recollections of my stay there. We were taught good manners and made to have respect not only for our teachers, but also for scholars and the elderly. There was no bullying, and if you wanted a scrap, you went to the gym and you had it out with gloves in the presence of Mr. Joseph. Now, what a great idea. Wouldn't that be wonderful in today's schools? So much for the consumers. But what about the powers? Well, the London County Council inspector who visited the girls' school in 1939 found students who are eager and intelligent, have a lively curiosity, which is encouraged by free discussion, and display a keen desire for knowledge and a real interest in their work. And as far as the boys were concerned, an inspector reporting on his visit in 1938 concluded that the school exercises a widespread influence for good over the community. The Bell Lane site came to an end with the outbreak of war. The school was closed, and in 1939, and the students, and amongst them, Mr. Jack Weinberg, were evacuated. The site was destroyed by Hitler's bombers in 1941. But September 1939 also marked the end of an era for the Jewish East End. The manner in which Jewish immigrants had settled there made the best of the few natural resources available locally and emerged from it as responsible and respectable body of citizens was nothing short of miraculous. The overwhelming majority arrived poor, few spoke English, and they engaged in work that was irregular and lowly paid. With the assistance of the better off in the community, a network of efficient charitable organisations was set up, whose main aim wasn't simply to provide immediate relief, but relief accompanied by the means to enable the poor to become self-supporting. This they did without compromising their religion or their Jewish identity, and the plot played in all of this by the Jews' Free School cannot be exaggerated. So let's pick the story up at the end of the war. In 1945, there were two questions on the table. Should the school be rebuilt? And if so, where? The Jewish population of the East End had emigrated to other areas of London. There was now no local community to support a Jewish school in the East End, and who would want to travel there? Indeed, was there a need for a Jewish school at all? The ex-East End community had become affluent and had developed high expectations. Anglicisation had worked, and the former pupils of Bell Lane wanted university and a profession for their children. There were local authority schools, grammar schools with significant Jewish populations. What was wrong with them? You could make your own arrangements for Jewish studies, and that way you could have your cake and eat it. Nonetheless, it was decided to go ahead with a new Jewish secondary school, and the arguments that took place were protracted, often acrimonious, and made the debate over Brexit like a storm in a teacup. If there was to be a school, under whose authority would it operate? Who would pay for it? Who would govern it? Who could come to it? Who wasn't allowed to come to it? You can imagine. In the event, and to cut an extremely complex and stormy story short, the United Synagogue, as it were, won the franchise. And on Sunday, the 7th of September 1958, Chief Rabbi Israel Brody taped a mezuzah onto the doorpost at the front of the building, and on the following day, the JFS secondary school opened in Camden Town. And Chief, I hope you can see my red pointer here. Chief Rabbi Brody is here poking his head over that shoulder. This gentleman here we will have words about in a moment. And this is Dr. Edward Conway, who would become the head teacher at the school. Now, why Camden Town? Well, Camden Town had been chosen because of its travel links. There were train and tube stations close by, buses to and from Stamford Hill and North London stopped outside the school. Everybody could get to it. There was to be a governing body of 18 representing the London Board of Jewish Religious Education, the arm of the United Synagogue, and the London County Council. And Chief Rabbi Brody was the president. And there is the Camden Site, some years after 1958, the old Camden Site, the main entrance. The secretary of the governing body was the gentleman I pointed out to you a moment ago, second from the right, if my thingy's not working, and his name is Nathan Rubin. And he was one of the most influential figures in the history of the school. He also happens to be, for those of you who know David Rubin, who lives in Regal Way, this is David's father. Nat was a larger-than-life character, both literally and metaphorically. He'd been recruited by the chief rabbi from the London County Council, and he had an encyclopedic knowledge of the minutiae of education legislation. JFS flowed through his veins, and he would have you believe that he built the Camden School himself, brick by brick. That wasn't far from the truth. And there they are, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, walking through the school gates, the first intake into the Jewish Free School. While talking about the Jewish Free School in Camden, I'd also like to welcome, I noticed before I started, Dr. Jeff Levison, who was a governor of the school on the Camden site. And he was part of the team that made the disastrous decision to appoint me. Anyway, Dr. Edward Conway was to be the new head of the new JFS. Dr. Conway had previously been head of the King David schools in Liverpool and principal of the Norwood Jewish Orphanage. Clearly an experienced teacher, he was also a published author on comprehensive education. Dr. Conway's aims for the school were simple: to provide a general education equal to that given in the best secondary schools in London, and to make JFS a bastion of Jewish ideals. The school decided it would have a house system, which is still in existence today, with all the students going to one of four houses. There was an angel house, named for Moses Angel, the remarkable head teacher I mentioned earlier. And there was a Zangel house, recalling Israel Zangel. There was also a Brodetsky house, and there is Zelig Brodetsky, who was an ex-student of the school, who became Professor Zelig Brodetsky and a celebrated Cambridge University mathematician. He was also president of the Board of Deputies and president of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And the fourth house was called Weizmann House, named after Chaim Weizmann, of course, the first president of the State of Israel. And in the naming of these four houses, I think you can see how JFS was seeking not only to retain its links with the past, but also to make a public statement about the type of adults it hoped its students would become. And similar thinking, by the way, led us to name the sixth form block in the Kenton JFS after Sir Moses Montefiore. In his school log for the 19th of December 1958, Dr. Conway noted that it had been a hectic first term, but things settled down. And in 1963, Dr. Conway was able to tell the governors that substantial progress had been made in all departments. There was ample evidence that the school was no longer seen as a school only for those children who failed the 11 plus. And Mr. Burrows, a senior inspector at the Ministry of Education, said he considered the standard of teaching in Camden as good as in any grammar school. In his Prize Day report for 1974, Dr. Conway launched a radical scheme when he said, forgive my any attempt to imitate Dr. Conway's Welsh accent, I am more convinced now than ever before that Jewish education in its widest interpretation can be adequate only if pupils exposed to it for an appropriate period in its most natural environment, that is, within our residential school community in Israel. And so was the JFS residential program born, first at Givat Washington in Ashdod, then at Yiminod near Haifa, then on Kibbutz Lavin near Tiberias, and now at the Alexander Mas High School in Hot HaSharon. Students in year 9, that's the third year in Old English, have the opportunity to study and live in Israel. When the scheme began, the students were in Israel for 5 months, but over the years that's reduced to approximately 1 term. And this idea remains unique, certainly in British schools. Dr. Conway retired in 1976 and was succeeded in JFS time-honoured fashion by his deputy, Leslie Gatoff. Dr. Conway may have been the innovator, but Leslie Gatoff was the consolidator. There was steady improvement in examination results, and in 1979, 2 students won open exhibitions to Oxford. Leslie Gatoff retired in 1985 and was succeeded by his deputy too. But this one was different. This one, ruffling the feathers of the Anglo-Jewish establishment, to put it mildly, was a woman. Described by the JC, among others, as the redoubtable Mrs. Wagerman, the late Dr. Jerry Black, in his History of JFS, describes Jo Wagerman as expansive, outgoing, colourful, ebullient, driving, emotional. And it's difficult to disagree with any of that. Jo was totally devoted to JFS, and woe betide anybody, anywhere, who dared to criticise it. She was on a mission to make her school irresistible. Now, JFS's competitors in the late 1980s, Jo was appointed just before me, so we're talking about a period about 1984, 85 and onwards. As I say, JFS competitors in those days, other than the other Jewish schools, were largely the private schools. There was a considerable lack of faith in state education at the time. And while parents might have been happy to send their children to state primary schools, when things got serious at 11 plus, many were choosing the private sector. And I don't know what private school fees are now, but at that time they were within the reach of many potential JFS families, and that's where a significant number of the children gravitated. In an attempt to combat this, we introduced 2 what we called accelerated classes in each cohort of 240 students entering JFS as 11 plus. Parents soon saw that JFS meant business. These accelerated classes began to attract children who had previously gone elsewhere. And when the year group with the first accelerated classes reached A-level, they produced the highest number of Oxbridge entrants that the school had ever had. Joe Ageman also wanted to bring the JS curriculum into the 20th century. And under the leadership of one of my colleague deputies, Ruth Robbins, 3 young men, Rabbis Mark Camp, Danny Rottenberg, and Frank Lewis, completely rewrote the Jewish studies curriculum, making it relevant to the young people who were studying it. And Jewish studies became one of the most popular and, in examination terms, one of the most successful subjects in the school. We also created an informal Jewish education department, the first British school to do so, and both the Jewish Studies department and the informal department, which became known as JEEP, became models for other Jewish schools, both at home and abroad. Incidentally, it was Joe Ageman who changed the official name of the school from the Jews Free School to JFS. The Jews Free, she said, sounded like something out of Dickens. Yeah, and what if someone asks what JFS stands for, we asked. Oh, you'll think of something, was the reply. Joe, who of course sadly passed away a couple of years ago, retired in 1992 and was succeeded by her deputy, Ruth Robbins. Ruth had been brought up and educated in South Africa. She was a master strategist and a brilliant, if tough and unrelenting, teacher of leadership. Believe me, I still have the scars. The school continued to prosper and its reputation zoomed following Ofsted's outstanding judgments on the school. However, it became clearer and clearer that the Camden building was deteriorating rapidly. There had been improvements in repairs, but there was only a limited amount of repairing which you could do. At the same time, competition for places was becoming more and more intense. We could have expanded the intake, but where would we put the kids? There was no space to expand in Camden, and the donors who'd been so generous to JFS over the years were telling us they were no longer going to pour money into shoring up a crumbling building. If we wanted their money, they said, we'd have to find a new site. So we did. And in 2002, JFS opened on a state-of-the-art site down the road in Kenton. And that's where it now resides. It costs, even at today's values, rather more than the £3,958 that was spent on the move to Bell Lane in 1822. Even more in modern terms. The technicalities of this move were masterminded by a triumvirate of Ruth Robbins, Michael, who later became Lord Leaving, and he'd become a governor and would become president of the school. And some of you will also remember Ola Wagner, who used to live in Mount Stewart Avenue, amongst other places, who was chair of governors. As it happens, I was also a Mancunian Red. And we became friends when we met at a cheder similar to that against which JFS railed against in the Bell Lane days. As a result of the move, JFS was able to recruit 300 children each year, whereas it had previously admitted 240. It's given to few to create a new school, and it was both exciting and exhausting to plan the sort of school we wanted, yet the sort of school that would remain true to the traditions and ethos of the past. Once we were settled in Kenton, we addressed the familiar matter of the Jewish studies that the school provided. Many of our families wanted their children to have the opportunity to build on the high-quality Jewish education they had had in their Jewish primary schools, because in the intervening period, Jewish education, and Ivrit particularly, had improved out of all proportion in Jewish primary schools. In response, the Jewish Studies Department created an original program of advanced textual study. It's not how much of the text you go through that's important, we said. It's how much of the text goes through you. This resulted in more families from what we might call the modern Orthodox wing of Anglo-Jewry, incidentally, a considerable number of whom were ex-students of the school, and they started to send their children to the school. Ruth Robbins retired in 2007 and was succeeded by Jonathan Miller, who had risen through the ranks of chemistry teacher, head of science and deputy head. Now, he left the school in 2016, and after a year as executive director of LSJS, he's now doing consultancy work, and now we're up to date. Since 2016, it's true the school has gone through some difficult times, but I have no doubt it will survive. The school managed to survive the First World War and the Second World War, and also an unhappy period in the 1930s when rolls fell very low and there were threats of closure from the London County Council. And I have no doubt that the school will recover from these circumstances too. And maybe that's because, in part at least, that JFS is much more than just a school. It is one of the most important institutions in the development of Anglo Jewry, and it's a pillar of our community. It continues to educate young Jews and to give them skills and attitudes which will enable them to take their place as proud, knowledgeable, committed, and self-confident Jews in an ever-changing multicultural world, a world which has become increasingly hostile to Jews, where Holocaust denial is becoming increasingly more fashionable, and where the Jewish state is always under siege. But these young people are preceded by a proud tradition. The list of JFS alumni is impressive. I've mentioned a couple, but let's just mention a few more. Samuel Gompers, who immigrated to the United States, and in 1886 was elected president of the American Federation of Labour. The band leader, Joe Loss, the actress, Gina Bellman, Bonnie Bonata, the founder of the De Beer Diamond Company, Dean Furman, Dean Furman, captain of the South Africa football team and ex-pupil of mine, a very, very nice young man, Dean Furman. Lord Maurice Glassman, who's an academic, a Labour Party guru, Ray Kelvin, who was the founder of Ted Baker, Bernard Lewis, who was the founder of River Island, Barbara Roach, who from 1992 to 2005 was the MP for Hornsey Weston Wood Green, and during that time also held several ministerial offices. Stephen Wilson, current chief executive of the United Synagogue. And on top of that, sundry rabbis, journalists, businessmen, millionaires, academics, doctors, lawyers, accountants, the whole world. And if you have particularly skilled eyesight, and I'm grateful to Maurice Wiseman for this, the young man here, tall young man, second from the right on the back row, is another alumnus of the school. That's Alfred Marks. I should mention the fact Maurice's mother is an ex-pupil of the school. I'm just reading a book actually about an alumnus of the school called Maurice Cohen. And Maurice Cohen was at JFS in the 1890s, and he was a relation to one of my mum's bridge circle. Now, Maurice was a challenging pupil, to say the least, not that he was at school all that much in his period in the East End. And he became what is euphemistically called an adventurer, might also be described as a crook, con man, gambler. And eventually he found himself in China, where he became a general in the army. Maurice rejoiced in the title of Two-Gun Cohen because of his habit of carrying a pair of pistols. Two-Gun Cohen. You couldn't make it up, could you? When JFS moved from Camden Town to Kenton, there was a reunion one Sunday just before the bulldozers moved in. And a story from that remains with me. An ex-student wrote to us from Israel telling us that one lunchtime he was in a classroom sitting on a radiator shelf. A young woman came and sat next to him. One thing led to another, and they're now happily married and living in Tel Aviv. He'd heard we were moving, and by chance he was going to be in London that weekend. Could he wanted to know, come to the reunion? Of course you can. And could he have the radiator shelf as a memento? Yeah, we said, but you'd have to bring your own screwdriver, which he did. And he wasn't the only one either. There were lots and lots of people with screwdrivers and hammers taking away bits of school. But that was 2002. Let's go back to where it all began. And leave the final word with the Reverend Simeon Singer, who we will recognize, of course, as the editor of the ever-popular Singer's Prayer Book. In the closing years of the 19th century, having made a visit to the school, Singer wrote, "It is little short of a marvel that from material apparently so unpromising, educational results so extraordinary are produced." And you know, some would say it's not all that different today. Thank you.
Oh,
Thank
well
you very
done,
much, David,
David.
for such an interesting perspective of JFS. And do we have any questions for David?
Not questions, David. It's Rita Weinberg. My dad went to Bell Lane.
Your dad,
My late father, God rest his soul, went to Bell Lane in 1908.
Have you got any papers? Any school reports?
And then Jack followed, but many years later, of course.
I've spoken to Jack about it, yeah. Have you got any school papers from your dad or any reports or anything?
No, I've looked everywhere for anything.
Actually.
But he was there in 1900, even 7 or 8, but I think it was 1908. He talked about Bell Lane School. The photos were incredible. Thank you so much.
Not at all. My pleasure.
And
Thank you very
David,
much for that.
we have spoken, sorry,
Yeah.
we have spoken before, but
Yeah.
there was 2 schools,
Yeah.
Jewish Free School, or no, Jews Free School, and Jews Free Central School.
Central School, that's right. But they were the Bagel
2
Boys.
schools. One was in Bell Lane, entrance in Bell Lane, and the other one entrance in Middlesex Street.
Right.
And the difference of us that went to the Central School, in those days we had to wear a cap and doff it when we saw a master. There was a gold circle, and we were always known as the Bagel Boys.
Bagel Boys, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But thank you. It's been so interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you
so much.
Thank you very much for your reminiscences.
Michelle, can I just make a comment?
Yes, certainly, Joy. Go ahead, and then we'll have Barry next then.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that my younger granddaughter is at JFS at the moment, and she is the 4th generation on her father's side to go there.
Nice.
Wonderful.
Her father and his 3 brothers all went to JFS. Pardon?
Your granddaughter's
Father and her 3 uncles all went there, and her grandmother on the other side went there as well.
What are her uncles' names? Do you know?
Yeah, the Vaughan family, the Vaughans.
Vaughans.
Vaughan. Ian.
And
not
he was,
Born.
yeah,
Not
They
born.
were- they are only, the oldest one is under 60.
Born.
born or born.
A bit too old for me, I'm pleased to say.
A-N. But also, I befriended a lady through the League of Jewish Women many years ago, Katie Wolfe, who lived in Kenton. And she was, I think, a teacher there in the early part of the century must have been Bell Lane. And she used to tell us lots of stories about school then.
We were the.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Barry?
We were known.
Barry?
Sorry.
Quick comment. Absolutely fascinating.
We were known as the
Can you hear me?
Bagel Boys.
Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating story. Really fascinating. Always find it very interesting, the history of JFS. That last picture that you showed is one of my favorite pictures in a book, which I sometimes use at a care home and going through sort of memories of JFS. And I don't know if you got the second picture under there, how they looked like just before they left the school. But perhaps if I can try to show that picture,
Oh, yes.
you can see that.
I haven't seen that one.
But that picture is the second part, which I often show when I discuss memories that people that at a care home that have went to the school. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Could you hear me?
Thank you.
Danny?
Sorry?
Danny, you'd like to go ahead?
Yeah, 3 quick points. The first thing is I still use the Pesach, Shavuos and Sukkot matzahs from Bell Lane, which was given as prizes to my mum's family. And when my aunt died, she passed those matzahs to me, and I still use them in shul today. The second point is I clearly remember when Jonathan went for an interview with Joe Wagerman, and she said, I don't care if you're from or secular, I don't care if you're rich or poor, if you're Jewish, you're in. So, and the third point I wanted to make is I'm fascinated by this 1908 outing with 1,700 pupils.
Yes,
How
so
did they
am I,
get there by, was it horse and carts?
God knows. You know, they also, I mean, that's just one of the things they did. I mean, they also used, because of the link with the Rothschilds, one of the Rothschild women took the school to the wedding.
Yeah, that's how he got made.
The mind boggles.
It does, actually.
Thank you for a fantastic talk.
Yeah, thanks for your questions.
Wonderful,
David. Well done.
Do we have any other questions for David?
Can I just say my mother-in-law, Gerald's mother, also went to Berlin. I remember she made wonderful friends there, and
Yeah.
she recalled a time at Berlin as a very happy time.
Yeah, I'm sure.
It's right.
Thanks very much for that, Marley. Murray, is it, or Bernard's asking a question?
Yeah.
Murray, go ahead.
It's me, yeah. Thank you, David. Very interesting. I just wanted to ask one question. JFS is is not an independent school. It belongs. It is run by the government, is it? Or government, yeah. What is it? Sponsored? What do you say? Funded, yeah. I just wanted to know if it's exclusively Jewish pupils, or do they have entries for non-Jews as well nowadays?
You have to have a certificate of Jewish practice. But it's a peculiar English system. It's called a voluntary aided school. So you get the secular education comes from the state, but parents have to pay for the Jewish education. So they have what is a voluntary contribution. Although I can see Jeff Levison like smiling at this. I mean, not voluntary contribution, and I don't know what it is now and what happens. I can remember when it was in my time. So it's a peculiar English system, yeah, but it is a school for Jewish kids, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. That was very interesting. Yeah. Do you have any other questions for David?
It's Lawrence. Can I just make a comment quickly?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Thank you, David. It's been a fantastic talk. When you spoke about Two-Gun Cohen, apparently I heard a story about him. He saved somebody's life in China. That's where he become so notorious, and I think he's now buried in Manchester.
Oh,
I don't know about that, but he was friends with Chiang Kai-shek.
oh, see, yeah.
I mean, the man was a maniac, you know. I mean,
he's in Manchester now.
Obviously, a City supporter.
Thanks for a fantastic talk. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Lawrence. Any other questions? Oh yes, Dave. Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, my grandfather, my mother's father, was at JFS, was at Berlin, and you were talking about records, David. We found his entrant records at the London Metropolitan Archives. And anybody can get hold of these records. They're on microfilm there.
Oh, that's useful to know.
Yeah, London Metropolitan Archives, when we're doing one of our genealogy stuff. And you know, 99? No, that was early. I think it was 1898. I think it was there. So, but he would. What surprised me was the age. Was the age? I thought he started at 8 or 9, and left at about 13, 14. So I was surprised that it couldn't correlate the age of the school then as now. But it's there. It's all there for people to dig out.
Yeah, I know. You may recall. When we had our snack meetings live before the pandemic, we had a visitor from the Metropolitan Archive who talked about the Jewish collection.
Remember that? Yes.
I was going to make an appointment to go and see her to do that sort of research, and then of course the pandemic struck. So that's the agenda for afterwards.
Oh, that's it. Yes, very interesting. Thanks. Thanks for bringing that to our attention. Oh, Maurice, go ahead.
Yeah. I'd just like to say, great talk, David. I don't know if people feel this about other schools, but I've still got friends from my JFS school days, from the age of 11, and we just all say what a special school it was. I don't know if people think about that, about the schools they went to, but we just, when we get together, we just don't stop talking about our days at JFS, and we loved it.
Apropos of that, and although our son Daniel, of course, is not anywhere near our great age, but on one of his various gap years, he was on holiday in South America, and in the Amazon jungle, he phoned from wherever it was on Friday, just before Shabbat, and he said, "You'll never guess who's here." Remember those Israeli kids in the Europe of us? You excluded them for selling stuff in the playground. They're here.
Nice one.
The mother said, "I've been waiting to catch up with you."
We were in Luton Airport many, many years ago on our way to Israel, and someone said to me, "I recognise you. I think you come through Luton Airport a lot." And we realised it's not where she knew me from. She knew me from JFS.
Yeah. It is true that
airports,
the French
airports,
yeah, down there as well, yeah. The French, yeah.
In my early days, JFS was not a girls' school. It was two boys' schools, JFS and JFS Central.
Yes, that's right.
When they combined and became a girls' school as well.
He told us.
Yeah, the mixed school didn't open until Camden, yeah.
That's right.
Oh, it must have been when they moved to Camden. Then.
That's right.
Yeah.
Interesting story also about moving to Camden, you mentioned it. Now Rubin was responsible for choosing the site. He was also offered a site if you go up past Stanmore Station towards where Edgware School was, that sort of area towards the M1. He was offered a site round there.
Oh.
And he said, "Who lives round here?" Because you never know, do you? You just don't know how
districts sort of change. Yeah, that's right.
You never know. We had triplets, quadruplets come to the school from Luton.
Oh, really? Gosh.
Was Kenton the only site that you chose, or were there any other choices when you chose Kenton?
Kenton?
Yeah. Were there any other choices, and you decided on Kenton?
I think there may have been some talk about another site. Yeah, depending on there was another area that was going to be redeveloped. Building was going to be redeveloped, which I think, but I don't know.
Yeah.
I just remember the chairman of governors at the time, Jeff Levison's got his hand up. He'll tell you all about it.
Yeah.
I remember the chairman of governors coming and saying, when we're moving to Kenton, Jeff was a governor at the time. Arnold Wagner was chairman of governors. I was on the staff, and somebody on the governor meeting, and somebody else was. And one of the governors said, of course, the fact that the chairman of governors and various other governors and the deputy head of the school live in Kenton never even suggested that might have influenced the decision.
Yeah.
But Jeff Levison will know more about that than I do.
There was somebody from Brighton who went to JFS every day, and somebody from Surrey as well. Oh. I know someone now from Surrey that goes up every day to JFS.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
I remember teaching a girl from Northampton. The mother would bring her to school every morning and collect her.
Fantastic. That's amazing. Yeah.
God.
Jeff, did you want to say something about the rationale for moving to Kenton?
So it was the only affordable site with good transport links.
Oh, yeah.
And when we had a great fight with the London Borough of Brent over the Kingsbury roundabout.
Oh, I see.
It was originally a pentagon, and eventually, they were worried that there'd be extra buses there, and two buses couldn't go together. And eventually, after a long time, but after I was involved in talking to them, they chopped the corners.
Oh, I see.
How long did it take from finding the site to the actual building being ready, like all the planning and?
Several years.
Oh, that's not.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Do you have any other questions for David? Right. Well, thank you very much, David. On behalf of everyone on the Zoom this evening, it's been a great delight to hear your talk this evening, bringing the history of the JFS to life. Great insight.
Thank you very much. Right.
Let's finish off with this little letter.
Yes, certainly. Go on.
Vivian's just passed this to me, snipped it out of the Jewish Chronicle of earlier this year. It's somebody called Jack Honigman, from Cheadle in Cheshire. And he's saying, he's talking about rabbis who had written about regarding suitable dress for prayer. And this was very simply answered by the advice we received at the Jews' Free School before World War II. If you were granted an audience with the king, you'd be expected to wear your best clothes. So how would you be dressed in the presence of the King of Kings?
Oh, that's really good. I love that. Very good. Well, it's been a great delight to hear you this evening and bringing the history of the JFS actually to life with your insight and your presentation, and also seeing the historical photographs. And you are indeed an ambassador for the JFS school, and we've been very privileged to hear in the past 16 months some of the alumni from the school, and of course there are many alumni scattered all over the world. And I must declare an interest myself in that my father was a student for a short time in Bell Lane before attending a Jewish boarding school in Brighton, and that was in the 30s. And your talks demonstrates the remarkable history of the 4 school sites and its development, particularly to begin with by the enthusiasm and dedication of the Rothschild family, but its outstanding educational provision in all aspects of the curriculum and great innovation from very early on, which was indeed pioneering work. And reflecting on taking a party of 1,700 pupils on a school outing as quite a phenomenon. And I think about the risk assessment would take up a whole entire room, I think. And I do know 3 pupils currently at the school, and they extol the virtues of the school. They love it at the school. And in the past few weeks at Kenton, we've had the great pleasure of hearing a number of pupils giving Devarei Torah at Kabbalat Shabbat. So thank you so much, David, and may the school go from strength to strength.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.